Hello, everybody, including the folks who can't see me through the podium. My name is Dan Restrepo, and it's an honor and privilege to be here with you all today. To have a bit of a different conversation than is often had about issues of migration affecting the United States. But we're not going to talk about just immigration into the United States, but rather we're going to try putting this in a little bit of context of what's going on globally, but more specifically regionally. What is happening in the Western Hemisphere, because we're at a moment of historic human mobility, some of which is coming to the United States and is affecting communities across the United States, but not all of it. And so it's a real privilege for me to have these three outstanding leaders with us today for this conversation. From your all's right to left, Maria Jose Espinosa, the Executive Director of the Center for Democracy in the Americas. Betilde Munoz-Pogossian, Director of the Department of Social Inclusion at the Organization of American States, the oldest international organization of countries in the world. And Anya McMurray, the President and COO of Welcome.us. I've had the privilege over the course of the last decade in some cases, a little bit less in others, of working with these three remarkable women on the issues of migration in the Americas, and very much looking forward to having a conversation, and hopefully although this is a little improvised, conversation where we can also take questions from you all over the course of the next 40 or so minutes. But Maria Jose, I want to start with you. And as I noted in my brief intro, we're having a conversation about migration in the Americas. Put that into a little bit of context for all of us, because I think it bears kind of understanding where we find ourselves at this moment in time with human mobility across Latin America, the Caribbean, and including into the United States.
Thanks, Dan, and great to be here with Betilde and Anya too. Hi all. So the Americas, the region is facing an unprecedented flow and challenge and movement of migrants right now. Not only talking about the 2.3 million migrants that approached the US-Mexico border in 2023, but actually looking at the region. A lot of the work that I do, it's visiting different borders and understanding different dynamics. And one of them, it's the border between Panama and Colombia, which is known as the Darien Gap. And just to give you an example, if in 2020 we saw 8,500 migrants crossing the Darien Gap, in 2023, 500,000 migrants crossed the Darien Gap. And that doubled the number of migrants that had crossed the gap in 2022. So we're seeing an increase in the numbers, which is one of the issues that the region is facing. We're also seeing, and it is really understandable with this in mind, that international migration is at the center stage of the political conversation in the Americas. We are also not only seeing increased numbers of migrants and asylum seekers, but we're also seeing a diversity of migrants traveling and a complexity of the migration flows. And just to give you an example, more than 50 nationalities crossed the Darien Gap last year. And so it is really important to stress that in this complexity, we're seeing mixed migratory flows, meaning that we don't only have asylum seekers and refugees, we have people that are fleeing violence, we have economic migrants, we have children, we have unaccompanied minors. It's really what the International Organization of Migration calls mixed migration flows. And so if we see that, the Americas also is facing 5 overlapping displacement crises right now. And I could say that there are more, but we're talking about Venezuela, we're talking about Colombia, Haiti, we're talking about Nicaragua. In Central America, we have a crisis, and I would add migration from Cuba. In the past 2 years, we've seen more than 500,000 Cubans reaching the US, and that's more than any time ever in history. And so it's not only about the number, but also, again, about the complexity of the flows. All the countries in the region are now countries of origin, countries of transit, countries of return, of migration, and that means a huge challenge. The populations that we're seeing right now are very vulnerable. And that's another challenge that adds to the conversation and to the picture. And I would say that that's the common thread. For example, going back to the border between Panama and Colombia, of the 500,000 migrants that crossed in 2023, according to UNICEF, 120,000 were children. And so if we think about the complexities, if we think about the solutions, we have to take into account this scale of the flows, but also the composition of the flows.
To provide a bit more context for a second, to think about what has changed. If you think about the checkbox of countries of origin that you find on the census for Latinos in the United States, right? The only checkbox that you find for any country south of the Darien Gap is Colombian, right? If you look at the composition of who we are as Latinos in the United States, the vast majority of who we are is from north of the Darien Gap, right? Because historically, people just didn't, you couldn't go there, right? It's called the Gap because it's the only place the Inter-American Highway, Pan-American Highway, doesn't exist. It was too intimidating a space to be able to put a highway through. But yet we had 500,000 people come through it last year on foot. And that has, and Maria has been kind enough to invite me to go to the Darien three times, twice to the Panamanian side, once to the Colombian side over the course of the last year and a half. And it's just different than it was. And the other thing that I think, just from a magnitude perspective, in the world today, there's about 110 million displaced people, both internally within borders and across borders. Latin America and the Caribbean represents 8% of the world's population, but represents 20% of the displaced population in the world, right? So there's something kind of profound going on, that are a series of profound things going on that have changed the nature of migration. And I want to ask Betilde and Maria Jose. Maria, you touched on it a bit. Kind of what are the things that are driving people? And to begin to talk about, we'll get to the U.S. and how the U.S. is responding kind of within the United States, but how have other countries in the region responded? Because I think that's one of the things that gets lost in our conversation.
Yeah.
And I unfairly just asked you like 4 different questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I can start and then Betilde can follow. I think taking into account the complexity that you're saying, you know, we have what we call the traditional root causes, right? And that's, you have research that shows that, for example, from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, most of the migrants are coming due to violence, poor governance, you know. There are research that demonstrate why people are moving. But I usually, when we have this conversation on root causes, I always like to challenge the audience to think about a different cause for migration, which is the lack of a migration governance regime and migratory policies to secure safe, orderly, and regular migration. And I can give you a couple of examples on why that's happening. We can be talking here a lot about, you know, economic disparities, climate change, poverty, everything that's happening in the region. But for the purposes of the conversation, I really would like to focus a little bit on the policies that are affecting the movements, and not only US policies, I'm talking about policies across the region. When I was thinking about this, when we think about COVID-19, COVID-19 was a disruptor of migration in many ways, right? It affected health, it affected remittances, it affected the employment in the region. And due to all the restrictions that were put in place by different countries, there were different policies, borders were shut down, we can see now that a lot of migrants took different routes, irregular routes, to move across the region. And that creates different cycles of insecurity, of vulnerability, which I was mentioning before. Another, one of the things we face when we interview migrants at different borders, we talk to someone that's of Venezuelan nationality. And when we talk to them, we ask them, where are you coming from? And you might think that they're coming from Venezuela, from Caracas. No. More than 50% of them at this point are coming from other countries in the region, being Peru, Ecuador, Colombia. And so we see that because there was a lack of, regularization policies in those countries, or they faced different situations where people started moving. And so we're seeing secondary and tertiary displacement right now. And I think that that is affecting the movements and the nationalities and the diversity that Dan was mentioning. Something else that I think it's a reflection of how policies impact the movements are visa restrictions. And so 2 or 3 years ago, a Venezuelan national could take a plane and go to Mexico, move to the border, and request asylum at the US-Mexico border. 2 years ago, I think, the Mexican government put visa restrictions on Venezuelans, and that happened across the region in Costa Rica, in Panama. What happened there? A lot of Venezuelans started crossing the Darien Gap. And so that created a new route that is very dangerous, it's very violent, and people started moving through that route, increasing again the vulnerabilities and sometimes even the reasons why people are moving. Another reason I think that is impacting this, and again, it's all related, it's mis and disinformation, and the role that some of the smuggling and criminal networks are playing. But this was a result, actually, of a policy that made Venezuelans use an irregular route to come to the United States instead of taking a flight directly to Mexico and request asylum at the US-Mexico border. So, in general, I also think it's important to keep in mind that forced displacement is growing in the region. And to add to the numbers, if you look at forced displacement in the worldwide, in 2022, 2 of the 5 asylum applications worldwide were made by 3 countries in Latin America. And so that's the scale of the movement, but also of the factors that are making people move. And we cannot look at them separately.
So, a point to complement the context that you, Dan, as well as Maria Jose, were talking about, and to illustrate the unprecedented nature of migration in the region, especially intra-regional migration. We have countries such as Costa Rica or Chile, where around 8% of the population is of foreign origin, most of them from countries of the region. So imagine the magnitude. And perhaps I'm going to take a more optimistic look at, to contrast perhaps what Maria Jose is mentioning. And of course, because I sit in an intergovernmental organization where I have to work with governments from the region that have had to respond to these unprecedented flows, if I had to characterize the responses, I would definitely say pragmatic, in the sense that these countries have realized that these people are coming and they have no choice but to respond, and with this idea that the possibility of taking advantage of the arrival, the talent and contributions that this population can bring to the country is directly proportional to the investment they do in policies, in designing them, implementing them, and evaluating them. The second characteristic I would say is that it has been somewhat balanced, in the sense that any country that has to design a migration policy has to reconcile this tension between protecting borders, the security aspect, which any country is entitled to do, as well as the protection of the rights of these populations that, as Maria Jose is describing, they come in very precarious conditions. And I personally, in the evaluation that we do at the OAS, have seen that they struggle with this tension, but they have been successful in terms of guaranteeing protection and complying with standards at the inter-American level, as well as protecting their borders. Sometimes that can be very controversial if they require a police report before giving the regularization option, et cetera, but they've managed to do this. And thirdly, the policies have shown a lot of innovation. And if we analyze the Latin American region, the Americas, as compared to other regions in the world that are also facing migration challenges, we see very interesting things coming out of the region. Are they enough? Probably not. Can they be better? Definitely. And Maria Jose has just explained a couple of reasons why. But if we look at the policies, and I have a list of examples that we can cover later, but if we look at the key challenges in responding to these migration flows, mainly humanitarian stabilization of these populations, regularization options, socioeconomic integration, responding to xenophobia and discrimination, we have interesting things happening in the Americas that could serve as inspiration for policies that could come from the US, but also for the world. Two key examples. For instance, on issues of regularization, Colombia approved the Estatuto Temporal para Venezolanos, a TPS for Venezuelans, that didn't just provide a temporary protection for these people, but is a 10-year option to stay in the country with another option to seek citizenship later on. Costa Rica approved a complementary protection mechanism to protect Venezuelans, Cubans, and Central Americans, I believe Nicaraguans. Just to give you a couple of examples, on issues of integration, in the context of COVID that Maria Jose referred to, countries like Peru, realizing that they have a very large Venezuelan migrant population, of which there was a lot of, or there were many doctors and nurses, accelerated the accreditation of their titles in order to incorporate them in the response to COVID in the country. Of course, I'm talking all good news because, you know, I said at the beginning that I am an optimist by nature is the word. And then another example, the countries of the Americas, although you wouldn't think, also face challenges of statelessness. Apatridia is the name. And the countries of the region, including Colombia, for instance, but also, you know, how countries responded to the issue of Nicaraguans being taken their citizenship. Chile also has a very good program on this issue, and Costa Rica and Panama that share a binational indigenous group, the Nouvelle have also developed a program to guarantee citizenship to these citizens. So there are very good things happening. They can be improved, but they can also serve as an example and as a way to exert moral pressure so that new innovations can also come from the region.
And we're going to come back to some of the success stories, and particularly the kind of role cities in the region have played in managing migration within the region. Anya, I want to turn to you with kind of two tasks. Talk a little bit about what Welcome.us is, and given the origin story that you're going to tell us, how it is that you all have found yourselves also working on this question of migration in the Americas.
Sure. So I, just taking one step back, I come to the issue of migration and immigration from the U.S. federal policy level. I worked on the Hill, the Senate Judiciary Committee for many years, and was there as the chief lawyer managing the bill that was the 2012, was what was supposed to be the big immigration reform bill back in 2012, 2013. And as we all know, that did not go anywhere. It died on the vine because the politics, that was the beginning of the really terrible politics that we have seen over the last decade and the increasing weaponization of immigration and migration. And after leaving the Hill, it became really clear to me that we had to take a different approach to trying to solve this problem. And the problem was really creating a space to have a pragmatic conversation around immigration and migration and how connected they are. Because to solve our immigration challenges, where we have lots of people in this country who need to be regularized, who need citizenship, who need a path, and we have many people outside of this country who want to get here but have no path. And because there is no path, they walk through the Darien. They didn't used to be able to take that. That option wasn't there until recently, and so we had a manageable border situation because it was just kind of hard to get here. It's not hard to get here anymore, and so we have to confront this challenge of more people on the move, wanting to be in the United States. Not all of them, certainly many of them want to go to other places. But from our domestic politics perspective, to recognize lots of people want to come here. That's not changing. It's not changing because principally it's not changing because climate change is not changing. So we are at the beginning of what is going to be a very intense and long period of time, and we have to have proactive solutions that confront migration as a fact, not as a want to have or a don't want to have. It's just a fact. It's happening. So Welcome.us was born in a moment when the United States across the country, Americans across the country, raised their hand to help a migration flow. And that migration flow was Afghans who were leaving Kabul, desperately needed to get out. And we were able to tap into this sense of what it meant to be an American was to stand up in that moment and help an ally. We had veterans who raised their hands, we had mayors, we had companies, but it was a whole of country response. And that showed us that if you frame this challenge of people in need, needing to find a place to land in a different sort of way, if you ask Americans to help in a different sort of way, you actually change the conversation entirely. And so over the course of less than 2.5 years, we have gone from supporting 80,000 Afghans arriving in the course of just a couple of months from Kabul into the United States to helping launch 2 new programs that the Biden administration really, I think from a very innovative approach, created what are effectively 2 new major pathways into the United States for folks. One of them is dedicated to people coming from the region, not all countries, but it started, let me take you on 2 more seconds on this little journey from, so what we saw with Afghanistan was all of these hands that were raised wanting to help, but it wasn't really clear how they could do it. We went to the Biden administration and said, if you open these pathways, people will help, Americans will help. We weren't able to do that fast enough for Afghans, but when there was the next big migration challenge, which was Ukraine, it was Russia invading Ukraine, there was another moment where the whole country raised their hand and said, what can we do to help? We had people watching the nightly news saying, what can I do to help this Ukrainian family that I am watching? Their home just got bombed, but there was nothing they could directly do to help. We went to the administration and we said, if you let Americans sponsor Ukrainians, they will raise their hand and those Ukrainians will be able to come very quickly. They will not have to do the only thing that was available to them at that time, which was fly to Mexico because they could get a visa to Mexico and cross the border. But we created a pathway, a legal pathway, and within the course of just a few months, we had tens of thousands of Americans who had raised their hand, and now 20 months later, we have 350,000 Americans who have raised their hand to support a Ukrainian, and 180,000 Ukrainians who have come through that path. Based on that success, we went to the Biden administration and said, there seems to be a problem at the border. There are lots of people who want to get here and don't have a path in. How about we take that same philosophy and apply it to people in our hemisphere? Let's ask Americans to sponsor, and if they say yes, then there is a pathway in. And what we saw for the folks where the populations where it was allowed were Venezuelans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Cubans. And over 2 million Americans have raised their hands. 2 million Americans are connected to a person from those 4 countries. They've filed for sponsorship. They are they're in a wait list to get here. 30,000 of them come every month. They come without arriving at the border. They skip the Darien. And importantly, they go to 11,000 zip codes around the United States. So they're not going only to the cities of Chicago and New York, where we've seen an inability to absorb them quickly. Instead, they are going to 11,000 zip codes. They're getting help getting on their feet. They're getting help getting a job. It's an incredibly powerful example of what we can do if we think differently. Now, what we need to do is have those kinds of pathways for lots of different people. And the good news is we're beginning down that path. There's something called Welcome Corps that the State Department just launched, which is a similar pathway for people from around the world, but we need more of those pathways, and we urgently need them for more countries in our hemisphere.
Thank you for that, Anya. So Anya is responsible for having invited me to the migration conversation some 5+ years ago, when kind of she had the foresight of kind of looking around the corner and understanding that human mobility was just accelerating. As has already been mentioned, the climate crisis The displacement from the climate crisis in the Americas and all over the world is just starting. And so this is a fact of life. It's not a want to or not want to. And at the time, we talked about the challenge, particularly in the Americas, that the U.S. has a one-door, one-place problem. Meaning, if you are living in Latin America and the Caribbean, and you either have to leave or want to leave, and come to the United States, there's only one way to do it for practically everyone, which is to physically show up at the US-Mexico border and seek asylum. That has completely overwhelmed an asylum system, has made it harder for that system to be accessed by folks who need it, who are desperate for that protection. And what Anya just described, and what Betilde described in a different way, is opening other doors, right? There's a lot of talk in the immigration conversation that people should get in line, right? There are no lines to get in, right? The only line to get in is the line through the Darien to the US-Mexico border. And the work Welcome.us is doing is helping create new lines. And what countries in the region have done is create alternative doors and alternative lines. By sense of scale here again, Betilde mentioned Colombia's temporary protected status for Venezuelans. So Colombia is a country of 50 million people. Since 2015, in less than a decade, Colombia has welcomed in 3 million Venezuelans, right? The city of Barranquilla, which is a relatively small city, but is kind of the first major Colombian city towards the Venezuelan border, is home to almost twice the number of Venezuelans, and it's a city of 1 million people, than New York City is today. And this happened one day to the next. The city grew by 10% in a 3-year window. So Betilde, with that as kind of backdrop, I want to talk a little bit about kind of those policy responses that you talked about, the kind of the success stories, right? Because again, this is, the numbers are overwhelming. This whole conversation can feel overwhelming, that there is no single solution, and that's true. There is no single solution. There's a network of things that need to happen. Anya was just talking about part of that network and its effects in the United States, but I want to talk a little bit more about kind of what the response, what the success stories are in the region of welcoming folks in and integrating them into local economies.
Excellent. And here, you know, you very well are referring to the responses that are coming from the cities of the Americas. That, you know, the topic of migration tends to be seen as a national issue, but if you really look at it, it's usually the cities that are in the first line of responding to the arrival of migrants and forcibly displaced populations, doing this with significant costs to the city and very limited resources, and a usually tense relationship with the national government. So the cities in the region are having a hard time and, you know, doing what they can to respond. Of course, the responses vary depending on whether we're talking about a urban area, periphery, border city. They each have their own challenges, but there are also interesting things happening in the region, in cities of the region. Of course, I have to give the OAS plug here. Yes. We have a report, a recent report that we launched at the Cities Summit that took place in Denver, Colorado last year, where it's called Reception and Integration of Migrants and Refugees in Cities of the Americas, and this includes over 200 interviews with people in 109 cities of the Americas, including cities in the US, by the way, and 25 countries of the 34 member states of the OAS. And of course, we do a systematization of what's the good things that are happening, what are the levels of integration in all realms of the citizenship of these people, economic, political, et cetera, et cetera. But we also map and we also provide recommendations as to how best to potenciar, no? Optimize the contributions that are coming from the cities. But we also map the good practices, and let me just refer to some of them, that relate to the roles that cities play in responding to migration. One, of course, is the reception of these populations. And one interesting example there is that of Brazil, that approved at the national level, but in coordination with the city of Pacaraima in the northern part of Brazil. It's called Operación Acogida, or Welcome Operation, or Operation Welcome, right? In which they, of course, take care of these populations in terms of the immediate humanitarian needs, but it also has a pathway to regularize their status in the country, but also provides them a pathway to full employment in other states of Brazil. Right, so it's the national government and NGOs at the local level coordinating also with the city, the governments at the state and city level in order to place these migrant populations in the cities that need this talent in their particular labor market. This is a very interesting example of in this realm of the role of cities. The second one. The cities also play a key role in coordinating with local NGOs. I always say that NGOs close the gap in the response that the state is unable to do, because even though they have to comply with standards and they may have the willingness to take care of these populations at the local level, they don't have the bandwidth, money, resources, people. So NGOs definitely cover that gap. And there's also very interesting examples of cities coordinating with NGOs. One key one was in Colombia. A few years ago, we had a lot of caminantes, walkers, and it still happens. Venezuelans have walking from Venezuela all the way, to the south, and now it's happening towards the north. In the case of Colombia, they designed something called La Ruta del Caminante, the walker's route, in which the cities were providing key humanitarian support to these populations as they travel their routes. And then we also have that going north in coordination with the Catholic Relief Services and these Casas del Migrante, or migrant houses, in which they stop on the way up north. That's another, couple of other examples on that. So 2 more roles, and then I'll finish. The third one is how to strengthen their institutions to respond to migration arrivals in cities. And here's a very interesting example done in Chile called Sello Migrante, or Migrant Seal, which is sort of like an award, right? An award that the government is giving to cities that adjust their institutionality to respond to the arrival of migrants. In other words, they create an office dedicated to migrants and refugees. They train their staff on standards of protection of these populations. They develop ties with the private sector to place these populations. And they have a series of, it's really a checklist that if the city complies with this checklist, they get the Sello Migrante, and then that means additional funding, a privilege to talk to philanthropic and private sector donors to support their responses, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, the key challenge of coordinating with national governments. There's always a tension there, but an interesting example, and I think there's a lot to be done there, but an interesting example is that of the locality of Tumbes in Peru, that at some point had a lot of pressures of people from Venezuela that were walking past that city. And what they decided to do to get everything organized, the support from NGOs, the national government, et cetera, is to create a task force. And these very flexible political dialogue spaces in which they can agree on things in order to optimize the response to the arrivals.
Anya, you talked about this a bit in kind of your initial remarks, and I'm going to ask you a completely unfair question.
Great.
Just to be upfront about it. Leaving aside for a moment a political will to really work the challenges here, what's the thing that's most missing in the U.S., kind of in the domestic response right now to the challenge, and particularly as it's manifesting itself in major cities in the United States, kind of away from the border?
Yeah, I mean, like are you thinking about how do we solve a challenge of New York or Chicago? You know, I think there are layers to this problem. I think one of the challenges that we have, I think there's a couple. I think we have, in the same way that we have a one door, one path sort of challenge right now at the border, people only can come in through the border. When they get to the border, they don't know where to go. And there's a combination of people are going on well-worn paths. Actually, let me take one step farther back, because I think, and I'm actually very interested in what Maria Jose is thinking from this perspective. I think another layer of complexity here in the US perspective is that the people who are arriving now and who have arrived over the last 18 months, it's a different population than it had been previously. Previously, it was largely people coming to reunite with family or people they knew well in the US. And so they had a place they were going. That makes all the difference. The population that's arriving now, again, partly because the Darien has opened, and because of increased displacement in the region, more and more of the people who are coming now don't have a family to go to, don't know where to go. And so they are either ending up on the other side of the border and then are being taken advantage of by nefarious political actors who are putting them on a bus and shipping them to New York or Chicago or Denver, or they are following people that they have heard gone to New York, Chicago, or Denver, and so they are going to those same places. And those places are not well situated to absorb this number of people. Partly, I think where this gets interesting also is partly because they have policies around sheltering, which is actually a great, I mean, my political position would be that offering shelter to people who do not have a place to live is a good thing. It also creates a magnet for people to continue to arrive, and it makes it more difficult for those folks to leave, because they would be leaving and going to a place that probably doesn't offer that same good. And again, whether we think that's just a complexity to the policy situation. One of the things that we're really trying to figure out at Welcome is we also know in this country there are lots of places that are losing population, that are hungry for newcomers. They are communities in decline. I'm from Iowa. This is where I'm from. You know, people leave Iowa. People like me have left. And so now there are towns all over that state that have available housing, have available jobs. How are we helping to make this match between the people who are over here and the communities that are over here that want them? And that, I think, is the biggest challenge for us as a country domestically, is as we look outside our borders, it's how do we create the pathways? The key, as part of thinking around that, is how do we create pathways that go to those places in Iowa? One solution that we really believe in is sponsorship. We think sponsorship is a way to activate the people in Iowa to say, we want you, and draw folks there. There have to be other ways. And we need better pathways domestically to go from cities that are carrying too much of the weight to communities that are hungry for the benefit.
That's an excellent encapsulation of something we've talked about a lot. That if you're managing migration at the border, you're doing it wrong, right? Like, borders are like the last place to manage migration. And for 30 years, the United States has been almost singularly focused on trying to manage it at the border and only at the border. Maria Jose, they're about to run us off the stage, so I'm going to give you the last word. And also, in a kind of equally unfair question, in terms of, as you look into the region, and I think you hinted at this earlier, but what's the one kind of policy recommendation, policy solution that you'd put at the top of the kind of to-do list to get to a point where more effectively managing migration in the Americas?
Wow.
Told you it was unfair.
Yeah, a couple of things to Anya's point. I do think there's a point that we're trying to make here, which is we have to look at the region. We have to work with the region. Anya was talking about Iowa and New York City, but Betilde was talking about Brazil and Operation Welcome and how they're actually voluntarily relocating people to cities where they need the jobs and where they need the population. And so that's something that we have to learn from. And it's right there. And other cities in Colombia are doing it. And so I do think it comes with a sense of humility in terms of how, U.S. policy is looking at this issue. In terms of the solutions and what I would put at the center, I do think there are good examples that Betilde mentioned of expanding. I think we need to expand the channels, complementary pathways. We have to think about labor pathways, resettlement, family reunification, actually pathways that are tailored to the mixed movement and populations. But secondly, I do think the focus should be in supporting integration and host communities. And that is done not only with the federal government, and I know, Dan, you are a big fan of NDBs and like international financial institutions, but actually how to work with international cooperation, with the Inter-American Development Bank and others to support some of these communities at the local or national level that are actually taking the populations. And in Colombia, we have the TPS, and they have 2.5 or 3 million Venezuelans, and they have a temporary protection status. But then comes the second phase. You need to integrate them into the community. They need a job. They need access to healthcare. They need access to education for their families. And so that, to me, it should be at the front center, because we won't have all the pathways in the US. We won't have all the solutions. I got asked the other day, do we think the numbers are gonna drop in 2024? No. Already we are seeing high numbers in the Darien. They already in January, they have 50,000 migrants. Last year in January, 30,000. So people are gonna keep moving. It's what's happening, and so we have to face it. So I do think increasing concessional financing for some of the cities, for some of the countries that are hosting big communities is important, and actually finding pathways across the region. I do think the LA Declaration for Migration and Protection should be that opportunity, and really the US working with other countries if we wanna face this, because again, we have to look at what others are doing. Parole is not enough, family reunification is not enough, and we're not targeting the populations that are on the move with one solution.
So thank you. Thank you to Maria Jose, to Betilde, to Anya. We, as you can see, we could do this all day. There's a lot to unpack here. But to underscore I think the core messages of this is not uniquely a US phenomena. This is something that the solutions for which do not uniquely lie at the US border or even within the United States. And that we need much better cooperation with countries in Latin America and the Caribbean and within the United States, between federal authorities and local authorities, to create a system that is beneficial for the communities of reception, and provide protection and opportunity for those who are forcibly on the move for a variety of reasons, and that this is not something that's going to go away. This is not something we can wish away. This is not something we can ugly away. This is a phenomena that is here to stay, and one for which we don't have particularly good policy responses for right now. But thanks to the hard work of these three and countless others like them, folks are working these problems. We appreciate your time and attention, and we look forward to continuing the work and continuing the conversation. Thank you very much.